Good evening, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to share a few thoughts this evening. By a very wide margin, I'm easily the least qualified among those assembled here to speak about Tagore. And unfortunately, as some of you might know, I'm presently not at liberty to speak my mind on education. Certainly topics in education that I'm most familiar with. As Chiranjeev ji said, mind is with fear in our contemporary times. I'll therefore offer some remarks that are cognate to the central subjects for the evening. The constraints on the liberty also mean that I seek your indulgence with my rather prosaic prepared remarks rather than what ideally should have been a joyous extempore celebration. Thank you in advance for that. Before I begin, I must set the record straight on the production of the J.M. Kumarappa reprint. Lawrence Surendra and Anil Hebar have been generous to fault with their credits, but those credits are wholly undeserving. The book that you have or you will soon have in your hands is entirely a product of Lawrence's labor of love. If you like what you see in the book, all the credit must go to Lawrence and Earthworm. However, if there are deficits with the book, it is likely because I did not keep up with my side of the compact. Thus, all your bouquets belong to Lawrence, and I deserve any brickbats that you may have. Today is August 8th, and the anniversary of the momentous Quit India Congress session in Bombay. However, I want to draw your attention to the long 1930s, interwar period that preceded it. We must locate J.M. Kumarappa's book in this larger interwar ferment that animated the best minds in India. Historiography of modern India has largely mirrored the ebbs and flows of the freedom movement. It has simply thus glossed over years between the end of civil disobedience and the beginning of the Second World War. After the epoch-making Dandi March that represented the high-water mark of India's freedom struggle, the remaining years of 1930s were a period of apparent quiet on the political front. The 1930s represented in some ways the lull between two major direct political uprisings against the empire, the civil disobedience movement and the Quit India movement. The scholarly neglect of the 1930s is perhaps best reflected in Richard Attenborough's eponymous film, Gandhi. In the motion picture, as many of you will recollect, there's a frame that shows Gandhi returning from India after the political failure of the Round Table Conference that was held in London following the Gandhi-Irwin Pact. The immediate next frame, the immediate next substantive frame, there's one frame where Gandhi is playing with the sheep in the ashram for about 13 seconds. The immediate next frame shows Gandhi addressing the large Bombay crowd addressed to herald the beginning of Quit India, whose anniversary we mark today. During the interim period, Gandhi, as well as his Indian opponents, were not overtly taking on the empire's might. They were engaged in an even more arduous task, one of forging the contours of modern Indian nation, state, economy, and polity. If Indian historiography has entirely neglected this decade, Western historians have admittedly taken a dim view of the 1930s. For example, in his magisterial portrait of the period, the British historian Piers Brendan has described 1930s as a period when the great powers of the time descended into a dark valley, quote-unquote dark valley. The long 1930s from the empire's perspective was a bleak period. The metropolitan centers were recovering from one war and preparing for another. The Third Reich rose during this period. Above all, the high noon of colonialism was behind them. The end of the empire by now was not a question of when, but rather if. I have argued that from the Indian vantage point, the long 1930s represent not the dark ages, but the crucible years, the years during which the broad contours of independent India were forged. These were the years when the principal Indian protagonists spoke with each other, debating the contours of independent India rather than directly battling the empire. Some of the most central aspects of independent India were vigorously discussed for the first time in the 1930s. For example, the broad principles underlying independent India's social compact were forged as a direct result of the epic clash between Gandhi and Ambedkar during this decade. This exchange, as I will show in a little bit, derives from a moral material dialectic that was first forged by Tagore. As D.R. Nagaraj, whose death anniversary incidentally is next week, has argued, the Gandhi-Ambedkar exchange during this decade was crucial to forging this new moral material dialectic. The broad contours of India's political economy were keenly debated during the 1930s, when a section of the nationalist movement, buoyed by the apparent Bolshevik success in the Soviet Union, clashed with the Gandhians and the supporters of private enterprise. The aftermath of the Great Depression, whose impact could be felt even in the subsistence agrarian economy, provided a compelling backdrop for these debates. The 1930s also saw the principle of national economic planning gain wide currency. Central to early political and economic policies of independent India was the experience of various Congress ministries in the provinces following the elections of 1937. As we all know, the years of the 1930s were also crucial to the evolution of the Hindu-Muslim question. Thus, we must recover the long 1930s on the subcontinent as the crucible years, rescuing this period from the various twilight years. Twilight years, of course, is the title of a very famous book by a famous historian, Richard Aubrey. Such recovery will allow us to appreciate the zygus that a Tagore or a Kumarappa helped forge. I'd like to focus on one aspect of the intellectual zygus for this period that J.M. Kumarappa most brilliantly elucidates in his book that was released here this evening. The world historical figures working in this period, and Gandhi, Ambedkar, or a Tagore, by any measure, your quintessential Hegelian world historical figures, but for only a world historical figure can generate the kind of antitheses of the kind this trio has. Despite their many differences, actually forged a common method of argumentation and experimentation that they all shared. Tagore's theories of justice, of ethics, aesthetics, education, nationalism, or political action are, like in Gandhi and Ambedkar, inseparable from his praxis. The widely used and abused retort of "my life is my message" describes Tagore the theorist at least as much as Gandhi. Indeed, Tagore pioneered the quotidian everydayness as the base material for profound theorizing. J.M. Kumarappa shows how, like Gandhi and Ambedkar, we must quote-unquote read Tagore's thoughts in what he did as much as in what he said or wrote. The creative dialectic between theory and praxis enables Tagore to seamlessly connect the lived reality of India to the structural underpinnings of education or even the empire. The dialectic between theory and praxis enables Tagore to address the urgency of now and here, and also simultaneously transcend the specific historical contingencies of his own time. Foregrounding the centrality of the theory-praxis dialectic is necessary to recover the true import of Tagore's theory and experiments. Tagore's insistence on theory and praxis, forming an undifferentiated continuum, provides one of the two primary fulcrums for his theorizing. At least as important as the theory-praxis dialectic is Tagore's dialectical relationship between material and moral objects. A dialectic that would, of course, reach, as I said, its apogee in the epic clash between Gandhi and Ambedkar. Indeed, one of Tagore's most important projects is to problematize the moral and material boundary. The moral-material problematic allows Tagore to connect his political, aesthetic, and ethical theories with the predicaments of the mundane everyday life. The famous Haripura posters by Nandalal Bose perhaps best captures these theory-praxis moral dialectics. In fact, if I knew there was space to display some of the posters, I have some of the reprints from the Haripura posters. They should have been here, actually. These posters best capture these theory, praxis, and moral material dialectics that undergird Kalabhavan and Shantiniketan aesthetics. We must parenthetically also note that JMK's younger and more famous brother, J.C. Kumarappa, played a key role at this momentous Haripura Congress session, as many of you will know, was presided over by Subhash Chandra Bose. I must conclude by once again thanking Lawrence and Earthworm Publishers for this incredible gift. Let me recount an anecdote to underscore the vital contributions reprints of this kind can make. I was in Ahmedabad on a characteristically hot and dusty March day to deliver a lecture at the city's famous Indian Institute of Management. I wanted to steal some time before the talk to visit Gandhi's Sabarmati ashram, and my host generously arranged for a taxi to ferry me to the ashram. And back once in the cab, I was preoccupied with my lecture notes, so when the taxi stopped after about 40 minutes, I was startled to find myself at a Bapu ashram, quote unquote Bapu ashram, that I had no interest in visiting. I had learnt on my very first trip to Ahmedabad several years earlier that the self-styled godman and now convicted rapist, Asaram, had been anointed as the new presiding sant of Sabarmati. While I'd been able to avoid this ashram mishap on my previous visits to the city, on this occasion I ignored the driver of my taxi who whizzed past Gandhi's ashram, rueing to recover a Shantiniketan or a Sabarmati from the ruins of Asaram. Indeed, as a card-carrying chemical engineer, as I was introduced, my doctoral training is in chemical engineering. I hope that this reprint can even perhaps inspire a new C.V. Seshadri for our own times. Seshadri's life work best embodies, at least from a chemical engineering vantage point, the theory, praxis, and the moral material dialectics that I have singled out. Thank you very much.